luxury yacht cruise becomes a horrifying betrayal when a wealthy husband abandons his pregnant wife on a sinking deck in broad daylight, choosing to save his mistress instead. He thinks she will disappear beneath the waves, but fate has other plans, for a simple fisherman rescues her and gives her the strength to fight. What follows is a story of survival, vengeance, and justice under the open sun. And believe me, you won't believe how far the truth goes until we dive in. Tell us what time you're listening and where you're tuning in from. Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The sun blazed high over the ocean, casting a brilliant light across the wide horizon. The luxury yacht gleamed like a jewel on the water, but something was terribly wrong. The boat was listing, groaning, and water was already seeping in through a crack on the lower deck. What should have been a peaceful afternoon cruise was turning into a nightmare. On the upper deck, a young, pregnant woman named Olivia clutched her belly with one hand and held onto the railing with the other. Her light summer dress clung to her skin as the wind whipped around her, and her eyes were fixed on the man who had promised to love her forever. He was not coming to her side. He was pulling away. Her husband, Ethan, a wealthy businessman, stood firm at the other end of the deck. His face was cold, his jaw set, and he made no move to comfort her. Instead, he held even tighter to the manicured hand of another woman, the mistress he had hidden in plain sight. The mistress, Chloe, smiled with arrogance, her golden hair shimmering under the afternoon sun, as if she had already won a prize. Olivia's voice cracked as she screamed over the sound of the waves. "Help me! Please! I can't keep my balance!" But Ethan's eyes did not soften. He pulled Chloe closer, protecting her as if she were the one in danger. He pointed to the rescue boat moored to the side of the yacht. "We have to go now. This vessel is sinking." Olivia's heart plummeted. She stumbled forward, her legs heavy, her breath short. The salty water splashed onto the deck, burning her skin. She reached out a trembling hand toward him. "What about me? What about our baby?" He looked at her, his voice firm and cutting. "You will stay. I won't risk everything for you." The words sliced through the daylight like a blade. For a moment, the sun's brightness only made the cruelty more acute. There was no darkness to hide his betrayal, no storm to blame. It was a pure choice, exposed under the honest sky. Chloe tugged on his arm. She laughed nervously, but triumph shone in her eyes. "Let's go. She'll be fine." Ethan didn't hesitate. He guided Chloe toward the small launch, untying the rope with quick, sure hands. The engine roared, and the ocean spray caught the light like broken glass. Olivia, the pregnant wife, stumbled toward them, her cries echoing across the deck. "Please," she begged, her voice hoarse. "Don't leave me here." Ethan's eyes met hers for an instant. There was no love, only calculation, only indifference. "Stay where you are," he said, without emotion. And then he turned his back. The launch sped away, leaving a trail of white foam behind. The sound of the engine faded, swallowed by the immensity of the sea. Olivia stood motionless, watching as the man she had trusted disappeared over the horizon, with another woman by his side. The yacht groaned again, listing even more. The deck trembled beneath her feet, and a wave completely drenched her. She hugged her stomach, feeling the small kick of the life inside her, a reminder of what she still had to protect. Her knees buckled. She fell heavily onto the slippery deck, the sun blinding her as tears streamed down her cheeks. The salty taste on her lips was a cruel mixture of sea and sorrow. She whispered to herself, barely audible over the roar of the waves. "He left me. He really left me." The yacht tilted again, and the water rose higher. Birds circled in the sky, their cries sharp and distant. The sun kept shining, indifferent to the scene, and in that merciless light, a truth became clear. She was alone, abandoned on a sinking yacht, with nothing but her child and her will to survive. The sun burned on the open sea, its reflection glinting on the waves until the light was painful to the eyes. The yacht listed more, and each movement let new streams of water onto the deck. The pregnant woman tried to stand, her hand gripping the railing so hard her knuckles turned white. Her heart beat hard, each thump like a drum. Her breath was short, interrupted by sharp pains that shot through her abdomen. She felt the weight of her child pressing against her body, a reminder of how vulnerable she was. The bright sky mocked her. The world was full of light, but she felt cast into the darkest abyss. The crash of the waves against the sides of the boat resonated louder and louder, mixed with the groans of the metal hull as it resisted the water flooding it. She stumbled forward, her feet slipping on the wet deck. Her palm scraped against the wood of the railing, leaving a line of blood that glowed under the midday sun. She screamed, but there was no answer. The launch carrying her husband and his mistress was just a shrinking silhouette on the horizon. The laugh she had heard still echoed in her ears. Light, cruel, and final. They didn't even look back. Her lips trembled as she whispered to the open air, "How could you do this to me? How could you leave me now?" A swell of seawater hit the deck, soaking her from head to toe. The shock of the cold water snapped her out of her daze for a moment. She tried to stay on her feet, hugging her belly, breathing hard, forcing herself not to fall. The baby moved inside her, a small but powerful reminder that she was not entirely alone. She looked around in desperation. There was no crew. No one had stayed. Every trace of safety was gone with the roar of the engine. The sun shone mercilessly, turning the sea into a blinding sheet of silver. Sweat mixed with the salt water on her face, irritating her eyes. She raised a trembling hand to shield herself, but the glare only clouded her vision more. The yacht groaned as it sank deeper. The smell of gasoline and salt water filled her nostrils. She coughed, trying to clear her throat, but the air was heavy, humid, and impossible to swallow. Her knees gave out, and she fell onto the wet deck. She cried out in pain as she hit the hard surface. She rested her cheek on the soaked wood, and for the first time truly believed she might not survive. A seagull shrieked overhead, its wings cutting through the sky. The sound was sharp and lonely. She turned her face toward the horizon, straining her eyes to find the slightest gleam of another boat. She only saw water. Endless, merciless water. She closed her eyes, her mind racing. She thought of mornings spent in the quiet kitchen, of her husband's firm voice she once trusted, of the dreams she had for her son. Every memory now seemed like a cruel joke. Nothing mattered anymore. He had chosen another. He had decided to leave her to die under the open sky. Her body shook with sobs. Tears ran down her cheeks and disappeared into the salty spray. Her fingers clung to the wood until her nails broke. "God, please," she whispered, her voice hoarse and broken. "Don't let my baby suffer." Another wave hit the yacht, shaking her and filling her mouth with salt water. She coughed violently, spitting out what she could, gasping for air. The sun continued to shine, relentless and cruel. The light, once warm, now burned her skin. Her desperation was heavier than the sea. However, inside her, a spark refused to go out. She slowly got up, until she was on her knees again on the slippery deck. Her vision was clouded by tears, but her hands clung to the railing with a desperate strength. She wouldn't let herself sink. Not yet. Not while her child's heartbeat pulsed inside her. The horizon stretched out, cruel and eternal. Her voice broke as she cried out one last time, even though she knew there would be no answer. the sound of her plea scattered among the waves, fading into the vast, empty daylight. The sunlight gleamed on the endless waves, turning the ocean into a field of shimmering glass. The pregnant woman clung to the railing, her body trembling, her voice hoarse from screaming into the void. The yacht groaned again, tilting more as water seeped in through invisible cracks. She felt her strength escaping with every breath, just as her vision began to completely blur. A flash of movement caught her eye. In the distance, beyond the piercing glare of the midday sun, a small wooden boat cut across the water. Its silhouette became clearer with each second, propelled by firm hands that knew the sea well. Her heart hammered, not from fear, but from a fragile thread of hope. She forced herself to sit up, weakly waving an arm in the air. "Please, over here, please!" she cried, though the words broke and scattered with the wind. In the boat, a fisherman, a man named Frank, squinted against the glare. His skin was tanned by the sun, his hands rough from years of nets, but his eyes were sharp and kind. He saw the sinking yacht and the collapsed figure on the deck. Without hesitation, he rowed toward her, his oars cutting through the waves with firmness. Closer now, Olivia distinguished the marked lines on his face and the silent determination in his movements. The boat seemed tiny in front of the collapsing yacht, but in that moment, it rose like salvation. She reached out her hand again, her fingers trembling in the hot air. "Please help me," she whispered, though her voice barely rose above the roar of the sea. The fisherman tossed a rope, his movements quick and precise. The line fell on the wet deck, just inches from her hand. Gathering her last bit of strength, she grabbed it and wrapped it around her wrist. The pull burned her skin, but she didn't let go. "Hold on tight," the fisherman shouted, his voice firm and sure. Her body scraped the wet deck as he pulled, his muscles tense against her weight, and the child inside her belly. She gasped, coughing salt water from her lungs as her legs gave way. Little by little, she was dragged to the edge of the yacht until she finally fell into the fisherman's arms. For an instant, the world fell silent. She rested against his chest, listening only to his heartbeat and the lapping of the sea. The sun shone on the water, and for the first time that day, it no longer seemed cruel. The fisherman held her carefully, speaking softly. "You're safe now. I have you with me." She tried to reply, but her words were choked by sobs. She placed her hand on her stomach, feeling the small kick from within. Relief flooded her body, mixed with exhaustion, until her eyelids grew heavy. The fisherman covered her shoulders with a worn blanket, protecting her from the sun. His boat rocked gently as he turned it toward the shore, moving away from the sinking wreck behind them. The luxury yacht continued to groan and finally surrendered to the sea, lost beneath the waves, swallowed by the light of day. Olivia opened her eyes one last time, looking back. She only saw water where her husband had abandoned her. The memory cut like glass, but in the arms of that stranger who had chosen to save her, she felt a fragile spark of hope. She rested her head on his shoulder, her tears soaking the rough fabric of his shirt. With a trembling voice, she whispered almost to herself, "You saved me." The fisherman nodded in silence, focused on getting them to shore. The sun still burned over them, but now its warmth had another meaning. It was no longer a judgment. It was a promise that she was not alone. The sun was tilting toward the horizon when the small boat finally reached the shore. The fisherman carried the exhausted pregnant woman in his arms, his steps firm despite the uneven sand under his feet. She stirred slightly, her eyelids heavy, her body still trembling. When she opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was not marble floors or crystal chandeliers. It was simple huts, with palm leaf roofs and walls stained by the wind and salt. The fishing village was alive in its own silence. Nets were spread out on the beach, shining with water droplets as children ran barefoot among them. Women washed clothes by the shore, and men unloaded baskets filled with silver fish that reflected the light of dusk. The air smelled of salt, smoke, and fresh seaweed. It wasn't luxurious, but it was full of life, and it welcomed her with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. The fisherman called to a woman near the huts, and she ran with a pot of steaming broth. Together, they carried the weary stranger to a small house of wood and stone. They laid her on a woven mat, covering her with a rough blanket, while the aroma of herbs rose from the pot, placed to one side. She sat up slowly, every muscle aching. Her hands trembled as she accepted a bowl of fish soup, its surface steaming under the fading light. The first sip burned her tongue, but it gave her a comfort that no expensive banquet had ever achieved. She looked at her belly, resting her palm on it. The child inside moved gently, and she whispered a promise that only she could hear. The contrast hit her. That very morning she had been on a luxury yacht, surrounded by silver and champagne, but she had never felt so abandoned. Now, in a place where the walls were cracked and the roof leaked when it rained, she felt the presence of goodness. Here, she was not a trophy or a possession. She was a human being in need, and these strangers treated her like family. When she tried to get up to thank them, her legs failed. The fisherman held her arm and shook his head. "Rest," he said calmly. His voice carried the quiet authority of someone who understood survival. Lying on the mat again, the sounds of the village filled her ears. Children's laughter, the lapping of the waves against the shore, the scraping of knives cleaning scales. It was a rhythm of unadorned life, a music of resilience and community. For the first time since the betrayal, her breathing calmed, and her heart found a more serene rhythm. That night, the stars appeared one by one, scattering across the sky. Sitting on the threshold, wrapped in the borrowed blanket, her eyes followed the constellations. The air was fresh, smelling of salt and smoke. She thought of her husband's face, of the coldness with which he turned his back on her, of the arrogant smile of the woman who had replaced her. The memory hurt, but it no longer crushed her. She took a piece of charcoal and a piece of paper that the fisherman's wife offered her. With trembling fingers, she began to write. Her words were simple, but each stroke carried the weight of her survival. "I will not forget. One day, I will return." She folded the paper and put it in her dress, close to her heart. The simple hut enveloped her, and for the first time in months, she felt something new. It wasn't luxury or love. It was determination. As the waves whispered on the shore, she closed her eyes and let the rhythm of the sea carry her to sleep. The village had given her safety. The child inside her gave her purpose, and deep within her, a flame began to burn. She was no longer the abandoned wife. She was a survivor, and her journey was just beginning. The mornings in the fishing village began with the soft cries of the seagulls and the constant rhythm of the waves lapping the shore. For most people there, that sound was a promise of another day of work and survival. For the pregnant woman, it was a reminder that she was still alive, that she had escaped the yacht where her life almost ended. However, surviving did not silence the memories. They came back in fragments, sharp as broken glass, cutting her fragile peace. One afternoon she sat outside, her feet buried in the warm sand, watching the children untangle nets. The laughter of the little ones was bright, but it transported her to another kind of morning. She saw herself sitting at a long marble table, sunlight streaming through huge windows. Her husband was there, dressed in an expensive suit, looking through papers while a servant poured him coffee. He had looked at her plate and frowned. "You shouldn't eat so much bread," he told her. "Think about how you look in public." His voice had been cold, the words cutting and humiliating. She remembered how she put down her fork, her appetite gone, her cheeks burning. At that moment, she convinced herself that it was his way of caring, but now the memory was revealed as cruelty. Another memory arose. She had once tried to surprise him by visiting her childhood friend. The visit lasted barely an hour, filled with laughter and memories. But on the way home, her phone exploded with messages. Each one asked where she had been, why she had left without permission, why she had wasted time with someone who didn't matter. She remembered the weight of those words oppressing her, how she had ended up apologizing for doing nothing wrong. That feeling returned now, coiling in her chest like smoke. She put a hand on her stomach and whispered to the child within, "You will never be made to feel as small as I was." The memories did not stop. They overflowed like the relentless tide. She saw herself at the doctor's office, answering questions about her pregnancy, while her husband leaned against the wall looking at his phone. When she mentioned wanting a more gentle birth, he interrupted her with a firm shake of his head. "We'll do it my way, the safest way. Don't argue." The doctor looked at her with compassion, but no one spoke in her defense. Her throat tightened. Even the moments that were supposed to be joyful had been transformed into reminders of control and silence. She looked at her hands, the same ones that had signed papers without reading them, because he ordered her to. The same ones that handed him her cards when he said she spent too much. The same ones that had reached out to him on the yacht, begging not to be abandoned, only to be rejected. The smell of fish and smoke from the village brought her back to the present. She blinked and the painful visions dissolved. However, she could not ignore what they meant. Her suffering did not begin on the sinking yacht. It had been building for years, hidden behind wealth and appearances. She took out the small paper she had written on her first night in the village. Her promise still stood, the dark words on the worn surface. "I will not forget. One day I will return." As the sun went down, painting the water gold, she squeezed the paper. The fire inside her grew. The memories were cruel, but they could no longer break her. They had become fuel, a record of every wound that she would one day avenge. The days in the village followed a rhythm as constant as the tide. Each morning dawned with the golden light spilling over the shore. The nets came out of the water, the boats rocked gently, and the cries of the seagulls mixed with the laughter of the children running on the sand. The pregnant woman woke up early to that sound, and little by little began to find her place among the villagers. Her body was still weak after the ordeal at sea, but she refused to stay inactive. She asked the fisherman's wife to teach her to repair nets. At first, her stitches were clumsy, her fingers slipping on the rough rope, but the older woman smiled and guided her hands with patience. Every knot was a small victory. Soon, she could sit among the others, working in the shade, sharing smiles that didn't need words. When the men returned with baskets of fish, she joined them to sort the catch. The scales shone in the sun, sharp and silver, sliding between her fingers as she learned to move quickly. At first, they pushed her away, saying she should rest because of her condition. She insisted, "I'm stronger than I look," she said in a firm voice. Her determination silenced the objections, and they let her work alongside them. She learned to row the small boats, her blistered hands fighting against the weight of the water. The sun beat on her shoulders, sweat ran down her back, her muscles burned, but she didn't complain. For the first time in years, her effort had value. She was no longer an ornament next to her husband. She was part of her own survival. The villagers began to notice. Children ran to her on the beach. The women offered her bowls of soup with a smile. The men nodded their heads in respect when they saw her carry heavier baskets than expected. They started to call her sister, a simple word that filled her heart. One afternoon, as the sky was tinged with orange and pink, she sat with an elderly woman who braided her hair with soft fingers. The woman spoke in a low voice. "The sea tests us all. It takes, but it also gives. It took you to the limit and brought you back here. That means you have a purpose." Olivia placed her hand on her belly and nodded. The baby moved within, reminding her of the future she had to protect. She whispered, "Yes, we have a purpose." Her strength grew every day. The pains in her muscles were signs of progress. The calluses on her hands were medals of resistance. Her child's small kicks were the constant drum of her determination. One afternoon, after hours of dragging nets, she collapsed on the sand, gasping. A group of children surrounded her, laughing and applauding as if she had run a race. She laughed with them, her face flushed with fatigue and pride. She looked at the fisherman who had saved her, standing with a quiet smile. "Thank you," she said. "You not only saved me, you gave me the chance to be strong again." That night, she wrote another note in her journal. Her handwriting was firmer, each word engraved with decision. "I am no longer the woman who begged to be rescued. I am the woman who will return." The sea roared in the distance, and the stars filled the sky, but her gaze was clear. She was stronger, firmer, ready for what was to come. She would never again be the helpless wife abandoned on a yacht. Now she was a survivor forged by the sun, the salt, and willpower. News has a way of traveling faster than the wind. In the fishing village, stories went from the beach to the market, from one boat to another, until they reached the nearest city. From there, the world began to notice. It all started with a headline: "Millionaire's yacht trip ends in tragedy. Pregnant wife missing at sea." The cover photo showed the rich man with his arm around his mistress, both wearing dark sunglasses and expensive clothes. They looked like victims, not culprits. The article painted him as a man struck by misfortune, a husband who had lost his wife in a terrible accident. On television, he appeared with the mistress sitting by his side. Both were dressed in black, their faces rigid in a rehearsed mourning. His voice cracked as he said in front of the cameras, "I begged the Coast Guard to keep looking. She must have slipped during the storm. I loved her, and I will never stop mourning her." The mistress dried her eyes with a handkerchief, looking down at the ground. But the performance couldn't hide all the details. Her words were careful, but her eyes looked for the cameras too often. The mistress's tears never touched her cheeks. Viewers at home began to question what they saw. Meanwhile, in the fishing village, another story was forming. A fisherman spoke in the market about the day he rescued a pregnant woman from the sea. His neighbors whispered the story to relatives in the city. Soon, someone repeated it to a journalist hungry for something more than the official version. In a few hours, a second headline appeared online: "Fisherman rescues pregnant woman abandoned on sinking yacht." The article spread quickly. Thousands shared it, adding their indignation in the comments. If this is true, he abandoned her. What kind of man leaves his wife to die while saving another woman? The millionaire's polished image began to crack. Talk shows repeated his interviews alongside the fisherman's testimony. Social media was filled with discussions, most of them furious. People demanded justice. Others demanded the truth. Olivia sat in the small hut in the village, her child moving inside her as she listened to the radio crackle with voices. She heard the announcer describe her as missing, possibly drowned. She touched her stomach and whispered, "They don't know it yet, but they will." Outside, the villagers gathered around a phone, the screen glowing under the sun. They showed her the online articles, the photos of her husband feigning grief, Rage burned in her chest, but so did determination. The world was beginning to see through the lies, and she would give them the proof they needed. The mistress, once proud to be seen with the man, was now the target of harsh criticism. Strangers yelled at her in public. Journalists followed her with cameras asking, "Did you know he left his wife behind?" She tried to smile, but her lips trembled. Ethan reinforced his version, hired lawyers, issued statements, and demanded that the rumors stop. But the more he denied, the louder the voices resonated. People no longer believed him. The sun set over the village, casting long shadows on the sand. Olivia stood on the shore, watching the waves break at her feet. She knew the moment was approaching. The news was no longer a whisper. It was a storm gathering strength. Soon, the truth would explode, and he would face the consequences of what he had done in the light of day. The morning lit the high windows of the courthouse, bathing every corner of the marble in sun. Reporters crowded the steps outside, their cameras flashing in bursts as murmurs ran through the crowd. They had come to witness what many thought was impossible. The woman presumed dead was alive and had returned to confront the man who betrayed her. She got out of a simple black car, her movement serene and firm. Her dark dress was simple, but it carried more weight than any jeweled dress she had ever worn before. In her arms, she carried a folder pressed against her chest. Behind her walked the fisherman with sure steps, his presence silent but strong. All the cameras turned to them, capturing the image that would dominate the news for days. A murmur ran through the crowd. "It's her," someone whispered. "She's alive." The words spread like fire until they filled the entire square. Inside the courtroom, Ethan sat at the defense table, his suit perfectly fitted, his expression composed to show grief. The mistress clung to his arm, her nervous eyes looking toward the door. They expected another round of compassion. They longed for pity for their supposed loss. What they received was a silence as sharp as a blade. The heavy doors opened, and the pregnant woman entered. All heads turned, all murmurs ceased. She walked with dignity, her face serene, her gaze firm. The folder was still in her hand, a symbol of everything she carried with her: truth, proof, and the will to speak. The judge raised his gavel, but the sound was lost amid the click of cameras capturing the moment. Olivia walked to the witness stand, her steps echoing in the large room. She placed the folder on the table, opened it, and began to show its contents one by one. First, the fisherman's testimony, his story written in simple words and signed with his rough hand. Then photographs of the yacht taken by the Coast Guard, showing its sinking angle and the absence of a crew. Finally, a recording from the port cameras that captured her husband getting into the launch with the mistress, leaving her behind on the sinking deck. A new murmur ran through the room, louder and sharper. The evidence was undeniable. Olivia raised her head, her voice firm, even though her heart was pounding. "I wasn't lost in an accident. He abandoned me while I was carrying his child. He chose the safety of another woman over mine, and he lied to everyone, feigning pain in front of the cameras while I was fighting for my life." Ethan shifted in his chair, sweat beading on his forehead. The mistress lowered her gaze, her hands trembling as she held her purse. The judge leaned forward, his expression hard and disapproving. Olivia continued, her voice gaining strength. "The sea didn't take me. His betrayal did. But I survived, and I am here to make sure the truth is seen in the light of day." The public erupted in murmurs. The reporters wrote frantically as flashes of light illuminated the room. The cameras didn't blink. Every word, every piece of evidence, every detail was captured and transmitted to an expectant world. For the first time since the yacht sank, Olivia felt a weight lift from her chest. She was no longer the abandoned wife. She was no longer the silent victim. She was a witness, a survivor, and a bearer of the truth. The sunlight entering through the windows seemed to rest only on her, as if the day itself had chosen her side. The courtroom that morning was filled with light, but the man at the defense table seemed to shrink under its weight. His suit, once impeccable, now looked too tight, as if it were suffocating him. Sweat ran down his temples and darkened the collar of his shirt. The mask of calm he had worn for weeks was beginning to crack. He shifted in his chair, looking at the mistress who was next to him. She no longer held his gaze. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, her lips pressed into a thin line. The confidence she had shown when she clung to his arm had dissolved into fear. She played with the ring on her finger, twisting it over and over until she finally took it off. She placed it on the table with a slight metallic sound and pulled her hand away from his. A murmur ran through the room. The reporters in the gallery leaned forward, taking notes and raising their cameras. Flash after flash lit up the room as they captured the moment of her silent betrayal. The judge cleared his throat, his voice resounding with authority. "This court has reviewed the evidence. We have heard the testimony. What happened on that yacht was not a tragic accident. It was an act of abandonment and deceit." Ethan tried to stand, his hands trembling as he hit the table. "That's not true!" he yelled, his voice cracking. "You're being deceived. She's twisting everything. She's lying." But the more he spoke, the weaker his words sounded. His voice broke, his arguments crumbled, and the crowd could see it. Even the lawyers beside him avoided his gaze, looking at empty folders as if the papers could protect them from shame. The mistress finally raised her head, her face pale under the lights. "I can't continue with this," she said softly, with trembling words, but clear enough for the whole room to hear. "I will not stand by a man who left his own wife to die." Ethan froze, his mouth opened, but no words came out. The silence that followed was louder than any scream. Outside the court, the news spread instantly. Screens lit up across the city. Stock market indicators dropped into the red. The value of his company plummeted as investors pulled out, refusing to be tied to an international scandal. Executives called emergency meetings. Contracts were canceled before they were signed. In the room, the sound of vibrating phones filled the air. Reporters shared the downfall in real time. Millionaire exposed as a liar. Mistress walks away in shame. Abandoned wife reveals shocking truth. The headlines multiplied faster than anyone could follow. Ethan collapsed in his chair, his shoulders slumped, his head bowed. For the first time, the world saw him not as a figure of power, but as a broken man, stripped of the armor that money had given him. The applause from the boards of directors was gone. The loyalty of the shareholders had disappeared. Even the mistress who had once proudly stood by him had abandoned him. Olivia watched from the other end of the room, her eyes firm. She didn't smile, but her silence had more strength than any outburst. She had waited for this moment, and it had finally arrived. The judge's gavel struck, sending a dry echo through the room. "This case will proceed with the full weight of the law. The court will not ignore the evidence of betrayal and harm." Ethan sank further into his seat, his face in his hands. All around him, cameras kept flashing, capturing his downfall. The mistress stood up in silence, her eyes full of tears, and left the room alone. It was the end of his empire, a collapse exposed in the full light of day. The trial ended for the day, but the echo of the gavel continued to resonate in every corner of the court. Outside, the square was filled with voices. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and the curious crowded to see the woman who had turned a tragedy into a fight for the truth. She walked out into the bright afternoon sun, her dark dress swaying gently in the breeze. The folder of evidence was no longer in her arms. It had been given to the court, its weight lifted from her shoulders. What remained with her was lighter, but infinitely more powerful. It was the knowledge that she had spoken the truth and the world had listened. The fisherman who saved her stood at a respectful distance, his weathered face serene. Around her, villagers who had traveled from the coast raised their voices in support. Their cheers mixed with the murmuring of the city until they became a single sound. It was the sound of belief, the sound of justice making its way. She stopped on the courthouse steps, placing a hand softly on her stomach. The baby moved inside her, a silent rhythm against her palm. That movement anchored her, reminding her why she had endured, why she had fought, and why she would never allow herself to be silenced again. Reporters shouted questions, their voices overlapping. "What will you do now? Do you forgive him? What message do you have for other women?" She raised her head, her gaze firm, her voice strong enough to reach the crowd. "I was left to die in the middle of the sea," she said. "I was betrayed by the man who swore to protect me, but today I am here, alive, because goodness still exists in this world, and because the truth always finds its way to the light." The crowd erupted in applause. Some cried, others raised their phones to record. Many simply stood in silent admiration of her strength. She continued, her voice clear and firm. "To anyone who feels trapped, to anyone who has been told they have no power, know this. You are not helpless. You can rise up, you can fight. And when you do, the world will see you." Her words resonated in the open air, traveling beyond the square through live broadcasts on countless screens. The image of her standing in the sun, one hand on her child and the other raised to the crowd, would become a symbol repeated over and over. When she finally descended from the stand, the fisherman approached her side. He didn't speak, but his serene presence was enough. Together, they walked away from the courthouse, leaving behind the chaos of the reporters and the increasingly distant shouts. That afternoon, she returned to the fishing village. The sky over the coast shone with sunset colors, pinks and golds caressing the horizon. She walked barefoot on the sand, her feet sinking into the cool earth, and for the first time in months, her shoulders relaxed. She stopped near the hut where she had woken up after almost drowning. The smell of smoke and salt filled the air, the same as then. But now the memory did not bring fear. It brought gratitude. She placed a small bouquet of wildflowers at the entrance, a silent offering to the people who gave her refuge when she had nothing. That night she sat by the shore, the stars shining above her. She whispered to her child, "We are free, we are safe, and we will never let the past chain us again." The waves came and went gently, as if responding to her words. The sea that once threatened to swallow her now conveyed another message. It spoke of survival, of rebirth, and of the strength found in the light of day.